It's intuitive to think that songs are hybrids of musical elements on the one hand, so melodies and harmonies and all of the rest of the things that we ordinarily conceive of as musical elements, and non-musical elements on the other hand, words and their meanings. If this is right, then songs seem to be different sorts of things to pieces of instrumental music. Songs are hybrids, pieces of instrumental music are intuitively pure music. And songwriters seem to be engaged in a very different process to the one that occupies instrumental composers. But is this right? Are we right to think that songs are hybrids of the musical and the non-musical? Or could it be that songs are actually just music through and through? I'm Jenny Judge. I'm a philosopher and I'm also a musician. And today I'll be exploring one of the intersections of those two worlds, and I'll be using philosophy to shed a little bit of light, hopefully, on the question, what is a song and what is it that songwriters do? Let's start off then by thinking about what music is. The ethnomusicologist John Blacking defines music as humanly organised sound. And I think this taps an intuition that a lot of us have, namely that being sonic, being made of sound, is a necessary condition that something has to satisfy if it's going to count as music. So it's not a sufficient condition, obviously. There's a whole lot of non-musical sounds out there, but intuitively it's at least a necessary one. Something has to be sonic if it's going to count as musical. Okay, so what about songs then? What sorts of elements are they made up of? Well, they definitely have lots of sonic elements. They've got melodies and harmonies and all the other usual suspects. But songs also, of course, contain words. And there are two features of words that seem to rule them out of consideration as musical elements. So the first feature is that words have meanings. And meanings, more often than not, have nothing sonic about them at all. So, they're not themselves sonic. And also the meanings of words, more often than not, don't pertain to anything sonic. They're not about anything sonic. And this is borne out in songs. You rarely get a song about sound. You get songs about love, and you get songs about triumph and regret and heartbreak and stuff like that. You don't get songs about sound. So it seems that since there's nothing sonic about the meanings of words and the meanings of words that ordinarily feature in songs, then we should exile those from the category of musical elements, since we're operating with the assumption that you have to be sonic if you're going to get to be a musical element. Now, there's another thing to note about the words of songs, and that is, of course, that, words can be uttered, right? And when they are, I'm doing it right now, they have a sonic dimension. But spoken words seem to fall into a very different category than the musical. In particular, they seem to fall into the category that I mentioned a minute ago, namely of non-musical sounds. After all, I'm speaking to you right now. I'm presuming that you're not in any state of confusion about what's going on, about, could she actually be singing at me? I don't know. It's pretty obvious that I'm speaking, right? So it seems that words as they are uttered, made sonic, seem to belong very decisively in the category of non-musical elements. And so since songs make use of sonicized words, then it seems that they must perforce make use of non-musical elements. So the upshot is that songs are very different kinds of creatures to instrumental music. Instrumental music is pure music, pure and simple. Writers of instrumental music are simply using musical elements. They're making pure music. There's something purely musical about their activity. Whereas the activity of songwriters, on the other hand, is kind of like bricolage. You're taking musical elements and you're putting them together with non-musical elements and you're making that work. And that's valuable in its own right, but it's a different sort of activity. So, in a while, I'm going to give you a couple of reasons to think that this hybrid view of songs is wrong. But first, let's give it a shot and see what the merits of this view are. Okay, so let's think about the merits of the hybrid view. It does seem to capture the sense in which, for a lot of songs anyway, it does actually seem pretty easy to, consider the musical bit in isolation from the wordy bit, the words and their contents. Sometimes you can even split them up, and the musical bit can go off to be part of another song, and the wordy bit can be set to different music. So, for example, this song is, the song that I'm about to play is a current favourite of my 2-year-old niece. Gonna get a bit of reverb happening here. Hello, reverb makes everything better. Okay, so this is a song that is a favourite of my niece. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. Now, that song is not to be confused with a different song, which is not as much of a favourite. Baba, black sheep, have you any wool? Yes sir, 3 bags full. And neither of those two is to be confused with this third song, which does receive fairly steady airplay, but probably isn't a favourite. And so on. Right, so you get the point. The point is that the same bit of music can be used as part of various songs, and it doesn't really seem to do any damage to the musical bit to kind of hive it off from the words and put it to different words. And that might make us think that perhaps the hybrid view does work for some songs at least, because, you know, the hybrid view intuitively predicts that the musical bit and the wordy bit are going to be, to some extent, pretty independently moving parts. And it also seems to make sense of the practice, which is widespread in music, of dividing up the labour of songwriting between 2 different people, with one person in charge of the music and one person in charge of the lyrics. This happens a lot in pop music. It happens a lot as well in opera. And it's often the case, even when it's just one person doing the songwriting, that the songwriter conceives of the 2 tasks as separate, you know, writes lyrics in a book somewhere else, plays music on the guitar or on the piano or whatever somewhere else, and then only later worries about kind of combining those things. There's a lot of instances as well of composers making use of previously written words, and vice versa, lyricists making use of previously written music. So, for example, the second verse of Celine Dion's All By Myself, the bit that goes, when I was young, I never needed anyone, ba ba ba, and so on. That's actually lifted pretty much wholesale from Rachmaninoff's second piano concerto, the second movement. I don't think Rachmaninoff had anything to do with the All By Myself bit, the verse, or what he would have thought about it, but, you know, I don't know. Maybe he'd have been into it, who knows. But, you know, so a lot of songs and a lot of features about songwriting as a kind of an industry that people are engaged in do seem to work well with the hybrid view. But, you know, for me at least, it just doesn't seem to work that way. The way that I write songs doesn't seem to kind of fit well with the sort of game of 2 halves conception of what songwriting is, or the hybrid view of songs more generally. And this has in the past given me cause to doubt the hybrid view and look for alternatives. So let me explain. So I'm going to use an example now to demonstrate, hopefully, some of the concerns that I have with the hybrid view. This is a song I wrote a while back, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the way I wrote it. So the first thing that happened was I thought of a figure on the guitar, which was in part suggested by a non-standard tuning that I put my guitar into, which is this. And I was playing around with that, and I came up with this little figure which goes like this. time, this was associated for me with the image of walking in New York by moonlight. I live in New York most of the time. And for some reason, I guess there's a sort of a walking pace thing about this music. So maybe that was what it was, and a certain kind of thoughtful mood that you might have walking around a city at night, that I often do. But then I thought, well, walking in New York in the moonlight is not exactly something that you ordinarily have occasion to do, what with all the street lights. So if you were walking in New York by moonlight, something bizarre must have happened to New York. And so then the song sort of became about being the last person on earth. But because this it's not an apocalyptic guitar part, there's nothing overwrought about it, it's pretty subdued. I kind of thought that, well, maybe being the last person on earth would be, sort of a thoughtful situation to find yourself in. It would be perhaps, tinged with sadness and resignation, but maybe there'd be a certain kind of joy or tranquility or spaciousness at the very least involved in it. So the song took shape then with the musical ideas and the thought contents, I guess, and the image that I had started off with really taking shape in tandem and exerting a kind of formative influence one upon the other. So I'll play the song now, and when I do, I'd like you to think about whether it seems to you that this song is a kind of an arbitrary combination of, music over here, words over there, squished together, and also all the images and anything else non-sonic over in the non-musical camp. So, I'd be curious to hear what you make of it and whether you think it submits to the hybrid view. So I'm going to fire up the reverb machine again. Hello? Hello, there you are. All right, so this is called How High the Sun.
How blue the sea.
So I'm not sure what you guys made of that, but for me at least, it just doesn't seem to me when I'm singing it or when I was writing it that I sort of effectively had to, pull things out of two buckets, the musical bucket over here and the rest of the stuff over there, and somehow make those things combine in a way that they perhaps would not otherwise be inclined to do, since they're so categorically distinct. But of course, my inchoate songwritery intuitions that the hybrid view is wrong might not be tracking anything real. But nevertheless, I began to wonder, is there an alternative to the hybrid view? And in particular, do we want to accept the assumptions that the hybrid view relies on, namely that the musical is, first of all, limited to the sonic, and second of all, necessarily excludes words? So I want to raise a couple of problems for the hybrid view now and point to an alternative unified view of songs. Okay, so let's look again at the two assumptions that drive the hybrid view. The first one is that being sonic is a necessary characteristic of a musical element. And second, that words, since they're part of language, can't be musical elements. And the question now is, are these assumptions ones that we should accept? Okay, so take the first one. First of all, this is the assumption that a musical element has to be sonic. So suppose that we accept it. We accept that musical elements are limited to the merely sonic. But now, notice that this implies that instrumental music is, as it were, pure sound. It only has sonic properties through and through, that it doesn't make any use of any elements that aren't thoroughly sonic in nature. But that's clearly false, because instrumental music is saturated with all sorts of elements that are either non-sonic or at least not purely sonic, right? So think about the moods and emotions and other feelings that instrumental music very often evokes. But not just that. Think also about qualities that are almost visual or tactile in nature that instrumental music inevitably calls to mind too. I'm thinking about things like the way in which a high ethereal string sound can put you in mind of lightness, of brightness, of a sense of spaciousness and airiness, or how distorted guitars can make you think of heaviness and darkness, right? So lightness and airiness and heaviness and darkness, these aren't all properties of sounds. Sounds are not, in fact, heavy or light or airy or dark or any of those things. But these things seem to be really important elements of instrumental music often. And what about movement? I mean, movement, if anything, is central to music. It's very hard to hear music as music at all without hearing movement in it. But of course, movement is not a property of sounds. Sounds don't themselves move anywhere, and they certainly don't move in the way that the music is heard to move. So movement isn't strictly sonic either. But now restricting the musical stuff to the merely sonic looks like it's going to leave out movement, and that seems just silly. It seems like something that would totally distort the nature even of instrumental music. So it looks like we should revisit the assumption that a musical element must necessarily be sonic, even setting aside the question of songs. Even if we just want to do justice to instrumental music, we should probably resist that assumption. But then, if we're allowing that the category of the musical includes more than the merely sonic, then we begin to see the beginnings anyway of pressure being exerted on the assumption that words and their meanings can't also be musical elements. And with that pressure, the possibility begins to open up that songs are no more hybrids of the musical and the non-musical than instrumental music is. But, of course, there's still the second assumption to take into account. This was the assumption that words are just necessarily different sorts of things to musical elements. What about that one? Okay, so I accept that there is a big difference between language and music. I don't want to take back anything I said at the start about speech, for example, sonicized language in speech being just a different sort of thing entirely to music. I think that that's true. But here's an idea. Maybe it's a mistake to think that the sonicized words that feature in speech are the very same as the sonicized words that feature in music. So what do I mean by that? Okay, so the thought is really that words effectively change their character when they appear in music, that they are kind of transformed into musical elements. So obviously, words take on different sonic characteristics in musical contexts, right? So there's usually an audible difference between singing and speaking. But you look closely at those audible differences and it becomes not so clear what exactly they are. Like, for example, it doesn't do to say, oh, well, speech isn't pitched, but singing is, because my voice is pitched right now. It's following a pitch contour, which you could actually notate if you wanted to, right? You can even start hearing it as musical if you try hard enough. Okay, obviously I'm exaggerating now. But nevertheless, the differences between the actual physical sonic differences between sound, or rather spoken language and sung language, perhaps aren't as dramatic as we might suspect. But here's another idea, right? So setting aside the different sonic characteristic, perhaps that hearing sounds as sung or as rapped or as otherwise part of music is to hear them as having an entirely different function or significance to the function or significance that they're understood to have in speech contexts. So maybe the suggestion is that maybe an uttered word actually kind of changes its stripes, if you like, when it's brought into a piece of music, and maybe the best way to understand what goes on is that it is transformed from a linguistic element into a musical one. Okay, so, and maybe that's actually primarily what it is to understand someone to be singing or rapping, for example, as opposed to speaking. It's not really a matter of picking up on different sonic characteristics, though there might be different sonic characteristics involved. It's rather a matter of understanding the words that they're speaking to now be doing something different to what they do in linguistic contexts. So this gives us a way of not abandoning the search for a necessary characteristic that something must have in order to be musical. We rejected that it had to be sonic in order to be musical, but now we have another suggestion for what it needs to have. The idea is that for any given element, it's something about the way that that element is organized with other elements that makes it musical. This, in a way, sends us back to Blacking's definition of music as humanly organized sound. Maybe the important bit of that definition wasn't the sound bit, but rather the organized bit. So maybe it could be that you have to have at least some sonic elements to get the right sort of organization, but maybe you can have other things besides and still have music. And maybe music really, at the end of the day, is much more about how it all hangs together than it is about everything's being sonic. Now, obviously, a lot more would need to be said here about what this suggestion amounts to, what sort of organization are we talking about, what does it mean to say that words change their function or significance. In a future video, I will talk about some of that stuff, and I'll wheel in the philosopher Susanne Langer in order to make sense of some of that stuff. I think her view of what music is gives us some tools that we could use to begin to disentangle the issues there. But for now, I want to step back a little bit and think about the significance of what we've been talking about today. So I think that going this way, rejecting the hybrid view of songs in favour of a unified view of what songs are, allows us to sort of have a lot of cakes and eat them, because we can keep hold of the idea that there is something importantly different about speech when compared to music, but we can still have the idea that words can, in the right context, be musical elements. The idea, again, is that words just function differently in speech and language more generally compared to how they function in music. And songs then are kind of arenas in which words are transformed into genuinely musical elements. And perhaps this is why, so it's because words already have this capacity. They're already, ready to be transformed into musical elements in the right context. Perhaps this is why lyrics are so easily combined with melodies and harmonies and the rest. They're already kind of proto-musical, words are. They just need the right kind of wand to be waved at them by a songwriter. So the idea then is that words are not different in nature from those things from musical elements, as the hybrid view insists they are. And so they're in a sense ready to be combined with them, because the differences between them are not so very stark as we were assuming. And this in turn, I think, means that there might be actually no big significant difference after all between instrumental music and songs. And in particular, it's not the case that instrumental music gets to be the pure music and songs have to make do with being a sort of impure compromise. This allows us to, respect the intuition, which I have, and I think many people have, that music is music, regardless of whether it's got words in it or not. And songs are no more or no less musical than instrumental music. And it also allows us to think of songwriters as really being in the same business as writers of instrumental music. Everybody is combining musical elements to yield appropriately organized wholes. It's just that in songwriting, use is made of elements like words that those elements don't feature in instrumental music. They could, but instrumental composers don't happen to use them. And one of the upshots of this, I think, is that we must expand our notion of the musical to embrace more than the merely sonic. But I think we should do that anyway, because it doesn't even work as an account of instrumental music. So-called extra musical stuff, feelings, movements, airiness, lightness, darkness, heaviness, all of that stuff can be musical elements. Their being non-sonic is no obstacle. The key thing is that they must form parts of the right kinds of organised wholes. And I think this really promises to yield a much richer and more realistic conception of what music is and why it's so interesting to us. It's not clear that we'd really be all that interested in music if all it was just bare, unadorned sound. So, a caveat before I finish, it could be that one size doesn't fit all where songwriting and songs are concerned. Maybe when it comes to theories of what songs are or theories of what songwriting is, we should proceed on a case-by-case basis. Because it does seem that songs get written in all sorts of ways and there are all sorts of songs. And it could also be that the hybrid view does work better as an account of what some songs are doing than it does others. So maybe we can be pluralists about this and allow that there are lots of different songs and there are various different theories possible as to what the nature of songs are. But I think it's at least worth bearing in mind that we're not stuck with the hybrid view, as it were. And we're not stuck with an unbridgeable gulf between instrumental music and songs on the other hand. And we're also not stuck with having to conceive of songwriters as doing a different kind of thing to writers of instrumental music. So that's it from me. Thanks a million for watching. Any songwriters out there, I'd really love to hear from you about what you make of all of this. Whether you think that the hybrid view or the unified view makes more sense to you, what you think is at stake between those two things, and just purely anecdotally as well, how it is that you actually go about writing songs. I know how I do it. Well, the extent to which I know what I do is actually even something that I've had to work for, because there is something oddly opaque about the process of writing a song. When you're in the throes of it, it's really not obvious to you at all what you're doing. So I'd really love to hear how it seems to other songwriters out there. I'm always curious to hear about other ways of doing this weird thing that we're all doing. And philosophers too. I'd love to hear from you guys, and please feel free to point out all the errors and fallacies and grievous, embarrassing mistakes that I have made. That would be really great. I love that. Again, I'm Jenny Judge. I'm a philosopher and a musician. You can find me at jennyjudge.net. I record and perform as part of the band Pet Beast. We have an album on Spotify called Portal, and we have more music coming out soon. You can find us on Instagram at Pet Beast Music, and you can find us via our website as well, which is linked to from my web page again, which is jennyjudge.net. And you can find me there, and there will be more videos about philosophy and music and the things in between those things very soon. Thanks for watching.